This video made possible by the Global Innovation Exchange. Visit gixnetwork.org to learn more.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. A little bit more about me. So I'm a general partner with Seven Peaks Ventures, and we're an early-stage venture fund based in Bend, Oregon, of all places. I think I was the first one in Seattle today with traffic. I was on the train, plane. I was here early. And I manage our digital health portfolio, but our partners do span other areas. Former head of data analytics for Oracle. And one that you may know, Tom Gonzer was the founder of DocuSign here in Seattle, and Tom is an investing partner with us. So we really love that collision of tech. And for me, the third of our portfolio, that's digital health. There's really some phenomenal opportunities to leverage that. And we primarily invest outside of the Bay Area. We love Seattle, we love Portland, Denver, LA. We think there's phenomenal entrepreneurs everywhere. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I am going to ask each of the panelists to do a real brief intro, extremely impressive group, and then we'll dive into discussing the power of personalized medicine.
Good morning. My name is Heidi Hagen. I am a co-founder and chief strategy officer of Vineti. I'll explain what that is in a minute. First, I'll explain my background. So I spent the last 30 years in biotechnology as an operations executive, heavily anchored here in Seattle. In fact, I'm a Seattle native. Spent 10 years at Immunex, worked with Enbrel and Leukine and several other products people are probably familiar with in the audience. Spent 10 years at Dendreon, was responsible for all of the operations for bringing forth the first autologous active cellular immunotherapy for prostate cancer. That was approved in 2010 in the US and 2012 by the EMA for Europe. During that time, I actually had to find a way to figure out how to connect up the order process, the cell collection process, transportation of those cells to a central manufacturing facility, figure out how to build manufacturing facilities that have not been built before, take that product back, and then work with reimbursement and patient follow-up with that. And so I retired from Dendreon in 2012. And since then, I actually was a global COO for a small cell therapy company in the Czech Republic. I opened up the Boston office, so I did spend a couple years away from Seattle. I'm back and very happy about it. Boston's nice, but I like Seattle. And during that time, worked in China, actually, which is a big burgeoning personalized medicine and cell therapy arena, and built a facility there, worked in Eastern Europe and also in the United States. For the last 5 years, I have been a consultant, and I help either, on one hand, half of my clients are VCs and investors looking to stand up new companies with new therapies, typically out of academic medical centers. And the other half of my clients have been cell therapy companies primarily, but sometimes complex biologics, in which they are anywhere from phase 1 to phase 3 to commercialization. And it was with that I came to co-found Vineti, which is a software platform similar to what I built at Dendreon. However, this time we're using the new technology of cloud-based technology, literally looking to connect up the whole entire value chain and to do it not just in the United States, but to do it globally so that we can better deliver these personalized medicines to the patients and the physicians who need it. And so with that, I will hand the mic over.
I'm Jay Shendure, so let's see here. So my training was at Harvard. I did an MD PhD with George Church, who many of you may have heard of, where I worked on some of the early predecessors of what's now called next generation sequencing. And then after that, I moved out here in 2007, where I've had a lab at the University of Washington, and I'm a professor of genome sciences. And my lab broadly works on new technologies in genomics, and so some of the areas we focus on include we developed some of the first methods for exome sequencing and applied them to show that you could diagnose rare Mendelian disorders with that technology, using cell-free DNA as a method of inferring fetal genomes, as well as for early detection of cancer. And then more recently, really trying to build scalable methods for single-cell profiling. And then in the last year, I've taken on an additional role as the scientific director of the Brotman Beatty Institute for Precision Medicine, which just launched last December. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more, but in kind of other hats that I wear include relevant to precision medicine, including advising on some national initiatives like the All of Us program, which hopefully people have heard of by now, and also in a commercial capacity, working on spinoffs like Bellwether Bio, which is our most recent new entity, which was launched from the BBI within the last few years and is focused on early detection of cancer based on fragmentation patterns in cell-free DNA as a non-invasive diagnostic. So lots going on, and hand it over.
My name is Elizabeth Krakow. I am a clinical blood and marrow transplant physician at Fred Hutchison Cancer Research Center. I am Canadian. I did medical school in my hometown of Montreal, then flipped across the border, and internal medicine was at Duke University, hematology at McMaster. I worked for a time as a hematologist, and I did a 4-year hematopoietic cell transplantation fellowship in Montreal before coming to Seattle. I've been here for 3 years. I spend most of my time treating patients in the clinic and in the inpatient setting, from the moment they start the transplant all the way through long-term follow-up. I also am deeply involved in 2 first-in-human T-cell immunotherapy trials for patients who relapse after their bone marrow transplants. So I'm on the other end of the spectrum in terms of the scientific and care delivery from Jay and Heidi.
Great. Okay, we have a lot to cover. And my hope is we can make it insightful and actionable, and use few acronyms if possible. You all are extremely deep in your areas of expertise. So Jay, the Brotman Beatty Institute for Precision Medicine, a $50 million endeavor, started a few years ago with the 3 leading research institutions in Seattle. And I find it interesting, the Human Genome Project kicked off in 1990. We're sitting here today in 2018 in Seattle, the first health track for GeekWire. There's a lot, as I mentioned, this collision of technology, healthcare research underway. Tell us a little bit more about the Institute, and what does Seattle bring, this ecosystem, this flywheel of innovation that could be brought to bear on personalized medicine?
Yeah, it's been less than a year since we launched. So it's really last December. This was made possible through a very generous gift from the Brotman and Beatty families, both of which are local to Seattle. And I think the idea was, so as you mentioned, this is a collaborative venture of UW Medicine, the Fred Hutch, and Seattle Children's. We're all equal partners in this. And it stemmed from a recognition that there's really tremendous excellence in individual labs throughout the city in areas ranging from immunotherapy to genomics to other areas. And nonetheless, what we lack, or what we lacked, and the need we're trying to address, is really a platform for enabling labs to collaborate between institutions, within institutions, and also access technologies that they might not have otherwise had access to under the current framing. And so I think it's been quite a successful launch. So I think the fact that we're recognizing a real need is shown by just in a few months we've had over 200 faculty sign up to be a part of this, and we're not forcing anyone to sign up. It's all voluntary. And we're launching a number of funding programs and things like that in areas of specific interest. So I'll just give 2 examples of the kind of work that we're doing. So one is we just had one of the first so the acronym here is BBI for Brotman Beatty Institute. One of the first BBI-funded studies, which was on the BRCA1 gene. So this is a gene that predisposes women to early onset breast and ovarian cancer. And it's been sequenced in over 1 million women in this country in the last 20 or so years. And yet, there's a challenge in that, even though we can sequence genomes now for $1,000, we often can't interpret the resulting information. So I can see that there is a variant in you in this gene, but I can't tell whether it's disease-causing or not. And so the term for this is variants of uncertain significance, and it's a big headache for clinicians, and it's a source of anxiety for patients. And BRCA1 is really just kind of the first of many genes that this is a problem for. And so we basically use CRISPR technology, genome editing, to make every possible mutation in a good chunk of this gene. And experimentally in the lab, we're able to kind of pre-classify each of those mutations as likely to be disease-causing or not. And so that kind of information serves as a database that when the mutations are first observed in patients, as they inevitably will be, one can go and look that kind of thing up, right? And then the one other example I'll give is just we recently found out a few days ago, so Debbie Nickerson at UW Medicine leads the BBI's genome sequencing platform through the Northwest Genome Center, and we were awarded one of 3 awards to be the sequencing centers for this national All of Us initiative, which is aiming to sequence the genomes and also accrue medical records on at least 1 million Americans over the next few years. So I think that kind of speaks to your point of the kind of thing that we're hoping to enable and really serve as a catalyst, hopefully, again, not just within these institutions, but hopefully also reaching out and being part of spin-outs and that kind of thing.
That's fabulous.
As well.
I think collaboration, it's going to be imperative in this space. And if we look at the tech side, and I'd love to ask you, Heidi, a little bit more about kind of traditional computational tech. So we're in Seattle, cloud infrastructure, AI, machine learning. Tell us a little bit more about that, and then I'd love to talk a little more about the implications on the clinical side.
So I'm sure to most folks in the room, cloud-based computing, AI even, and some of these other technological tools are your everyday thing. I think you'll find it surprising that for large pharma and biotech, it's not. This is an area of really what drew us, Vinetti, towards it, was the fact that you now had what was going on in Jay's laboratories and others, where you were starting to get a better genetic understanding of what was going on with particular patients, and therapies were then translated from that. But the question now lies in, so you've been able to determine what exactly the mutations and or neoantigens might be in a particular tumor in a cancer patient, and now what do you do with that in terms of understanding how do you actually translate that and deliver that to patients? So you can do so within, say, the 4 walls and laboratories and halls of, say, an academic medical center, but how do you actually put this out into the commercial market? How do you then ensure that you've got the right patient getting the right product at the right time? And so that's where we've started to see, and we're pushing biotech and pharma to accept cloud-based technology. They pretty much are all on-prem, so that's kind of the situation today, believe it or not. You can go to almost any one of the large pharmaceuticals or even small biotechs, and you will find SAP and Oracle and other basic type systems and platforms that are sitting on-prem and in servers, literally within 4 walls somewhere, and they control all pieces of this. So how do you actually bring together a patient, a physician, the ability to do cell collection, the ability to do some of the gene sequencing that you might need for an autologous cell therapy or a personal cancer vaccine, for example? You bring all that information, but you also have a physical product that you need to move through an actual supply chain. How do you bring all those different players together and all of those different actors who are in different geographies, have different roles, have different agendas, but need to be brought into the same platform? Well, it's difficult to do that. In fact, I would imagine if you really think about it, how do you do that without cloud-based computing? How do you do that without predictive learning? How do you manage this such that we can take what used to be available for now only a couple thousand patients and make that into something maybe 10 million or more globally? And that's what these systems are. However, we're in very, very early days, and it's something that we're really pushing. We're finding a lot of success through our efforts, but it is something you walk in the door and you say, hey, I've got something for you. Well, I don't trust that. That doesn't necessarily make me comfortable that I put not just my company data on there, but I've got patient data, PHI, running through there. And so we're now to the point that the technology can handle that, but that's not necessarily clear to everybody who's working with these therapies. And so I think that's one of the technological and business hurdles that we're facing every day.
Yeah, there's certainly a cultural divide. I see this every day. And I want to come back to that in terms of specifically to pharmaceutical companies and clinical trials, the impact to us as patients. Before we go there, I think of these transformative advances, and oncology comes to mind, top of mind. You work in this every single day, Elizabeth. So merging the opportunity to share data, to have these phenomenal research institutions being stood up, we're learning more. Where do you see the most advances in oncology? In which priority order are we solving in cancer therapeutics?
Sure. I'll answer that tangentially also through seconding what Heidi said. Sometimes in speaking with people in traditional tech industries, if you can use the word traditional and tech together, I think we can. And the term personalized medicine inspires ideas of like personalized travel. You know, all we have to do is match the person to the right flight at the right time with the right hotel with the right car rental agency. But treating cancer is far more complex than that. If you can imagine that you're trying to defeat an invading army, there's an infantry, there's a navy, there's an air force, there's cyber warfare. That army has many, many ways of creating that invasion. And there are very few cancers that boil down to one driving mutation that if you just target that mutation, the cancer will miraculously disappear. So it's not just about the mutations in the cancer, it's about the microenvironment, be that the bone marrow niche or the solid organ that the cancer finds itself in and how that microenvironment has been altered by the cancer. It's about the patient's immune system. And we're all focused on T cells, and I'm focused on T cells in my own work, but the immune system is far more complicated than just T cells. And so there's a lot of information to integrate. As well, it's about the given patient. Somebody might have genetic polymorphisms that affect how they metabolize a drug to make it either toxic or ineffective. Or they might be on other drugs for other concurrent medical conditions that affect how the particular chemotherapeutic or targeted cancer therapy will behave in their body. So treating each individual patient is so much more complicated than honing in on one genetic mutation. And that's the challenge we face in clinic. When we look at how medical records can help us, the first thing to note is medical records are very complex. There's structured data, there's unstructured data, there's data from many sources, there's often handwritten information. And in my work, I can also shout out to Dr. Tony Blau, who has a platform called All for Cure that helps to crystallize the information in medical records. It takes human beings still to go through the medical records and find what's salient. And I would love for artificial intelligence to be able to take out all the salient information from that medical record. I think everybody's aware of what's happened with IBM Watson in terms of taking shortcuts and avoiding that human component. But I don't think, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, that there is a technology that will get all the salient information from the medical record the way my undergraduate students will when they read every single page of a 6,000-page medical record.
It's a leap, right? There's still a chasm for us to cross.
There's still a leap, and it's not just as easy as looking for keywords and what's before and after those keywords. But I do think technology can help us.
But what's the opportunity? So there's all this data. There is a lot more data out there. Does that allow us to broaden the scope of who, say, could be included in a clinical drug trial for the next therapeutic? You know, you all are in Seattle. I'm in Bend. I may not have access to the same clinical trials that you could hear. So is there an opportunity in this explosion of information and to get perhaps better inclusion into these trials and get drugs and therapies to market faster? I don't know, for any of you to chime in.
I think it's true, but I would say there's two sides to it. There is the fact that we're learning more and more about particular disease states, especially in oncology. And as we drive to get the best statistical analysis you can out of a clinical trial, the inclusion-exclusion criteria is actually getting tighter. And I would say that's one of the drivers for it. On the other side, our ability to do data mining and to determine who should be in which clinical trial and to basically provide access and better information to those areas that are very rural to those that are very metropolitan. So I think that there are actually the technology and computing ability is playing into both sides. And I think that it could really, truly revolutionize the ability to connect a patient to a trial, but at the same time, we're going to be driving more towards making sure it's the right patient for that particular trial to give them the best opportunity for outcome. But clinical trials still, even with that, are trial and error. I mean,
Right.
it's called a trial for a reason. And so I'd say that from the pharma biotech side, that's what we're actually seeing, and that's some of the challenges that we have to face. And I think there's still further technology and computing platforms that need to come along and be advanced in order to actually really drive that patient access.
So I'm going to knock all of the tricorder discussion. We're going to live to 200, personalized medicine, and say, this is highbrow stuff. This is potentially high-class problems. There's a question, are we ignoring in some instances socioeconomic factors? So is this solution really for that diabetic patient getting their genome sequenced and getting some personalized, or is it that they need a sandwich and a ride to the clinic? So how do we marry these two? Because I think of being a doc and the struggle of all these technologies coming at me, phenomenal speed on that side, but on the other side, this mass of the population that's just not, their basic needs aren't being met. So I'm sure this question comes across your bows, and I'm curious what your...
I think that's an incredibly complicated question on so many levels. If you looked at the cost of a computer in 1950 compared to the cost of a computer today, if one had worried about the cost of the computers in 1950 and said, well, we can provide clean drinking water to a majority of the population for the same amount of money we can provide computers to the military, perhaps, would the computer technology have ever been advanced? And I see the CAR T-cell technology, the engineered T-cell receptor technology in the same light at the moment. The costs of these technologies, when commercialized, are absolutely unsustainable for our healthcare system, and they do rob people of perhaps other people who are not being directly treated of preventative medicine, of less expensive medicines that could prolong their lives. But at the same time, if we don't continue to innovate in this vein, I think we will rob humanity of a very important resource, which is the cure for cancer.
Jay, do you have...
So I agree with everything you said, but I'll just add that I think there's also an opportunity here, which is if you think about precision medicine more broadly than just collecting high cost data sets of various sorts or engineering high end personalized therapies, there's a broader framework for thinking about this, and you might have heard the term precision population health or precision public health. And many of these same concepts, about individualizing how we intervene, can also be applied potentially to the low-cost interventions that we know are effective, but do a crappy job of delivering, right? I can order a package on Amazon, it will come like in a couple hours. It's nuts, right? So, as things like compliance and things like that are issues, for healthcare, I think it is important, to realize that we do have, even people who are not so well off are walking around with devices that allow us to contact them or remind them, or we can ship something right to their door. There are ways of intervening, and this could end up being an opportunity to, improve health potentially at a without high-end interventions, but still under this framework of trying to be precise and maximize impact.
No, I love it. I absolutely agree. I think marrying the two is imperative. The last few
can I just
topics...
speak one more to that?
Sure.
If you think about the way we're delivering our cell therapies and manufacturing our cell therapies now, it's very centralized, but there are certainly technologies that are being tested to allow smaller hospitals to manufacture personalized cell therapies on site. And there's also moves in the immunotherapy space to make off-the-shelf products, which can eventually be delivered in a blood bank model. Yeah. So I think we will move there in the next 20 years.
The only thing I might add to that is I concur with all of that, and I think you started with one important statement too, is I don't think we have to ignore the socioeconomic or geographical issues at this moment too. I think that is the exciting thing about technology is, in addition to everything that's going on around the therapy, thinking about AI and predictive learning are things that can be built around the delivery of these products to understand where are patients, what do patients typically need from a certain area, and what sort of support and care you need to provide with that. I think it's a bit of a very analog way we do it now. We ask, we find out, and it's a back and forth, and it's phone calls, and it's fax, and other things still. And I think that there's an opportunity for more, I will call it more the consumer side of it, to come along with more of the digital health side. And I do agree with everything that was said. And then if you add that piece, then I think we're taking care of the future, and we're also taking care of the patients today, which is important because patient access is a huge issue. And I think we don't have to ignore it now.
We were talking earlier, I do some innovation advising for healthcare systems across the country, and there's one specifically that's really interesting, aging population across the state, 70% capitated, and they're all remote. You have to use technology. So it's kind of nice we're actually being forced in that direction, and I think then we can be able to optimize these personalized treatments. So thinking about us as individuals, and the last two discussions, we're capturing a lot more data. We were told to test our blood every quarter. There's phenomenal pros, personalized vaccines for cancer, immunizations, but there's also some potential risks and cons. And I was sharing earlier, as a parent of a child with a rare autoinflammatory disease, I'm sitting on this right now saying, do I do genetic testing or not? Pre-existing conditions, is he gonna have a record? Is he going to be cloned? I hope he is. He's a cute kid. But what are the cons that we need to think about having all of that really personal data, ourselves, out in the world?
I think that's a tremendously important question that everybody needs to ask themselves, and I sit on both sides of it. Pro for the fact that you should find out what's going on biologically if you have issues, and determining whether you have a diagnostic opportunity from genetic testing. But at the same side, living in the pharma and biotech part of it, there is an ability to get that data, and it's usually anonymized, but not always. And so recognizing it's a little bit like we've all learned with the internet. You take a selfie, you put it out there, it's there forever. So the reality is, so is your genetic data. And so I think we have, patients who need to realize that that's going on and recognize where that data is going to, and if they can, investigate that before they do this. But on the other side, if we don't, we're not going to continue to have the innovation.
Right.
And so I think what it begs towards is really having the proper regulatory authorities involved and making sure that the data is secure. A lot of people have heard about GDPR in Europe. We have HITRUST and SOX here in the United States. China and Asia have other specific policies and means per every country. But I don't know that that's necessarily enough. So I think there's another innovative side to this, is locking that down and securing it so that those who should have it can have it and do what's important for innovation, but also treating the patient. But it is the other high-risk factor that does exist with any kind of personal health data. And that is something we see. We've raised the bar with cell and gene therapy especially, and to the point that it's centralized manufacturing and there's lots of different people who see this data throughout. How do you lock it down and it's only used by those who need to? Yeah. And so that's a piece I think that we still have some innovation to do on that side too.
Someone should start a business and securing that. But on the pro side, Jay, you mentioned there's information that's really valuable, genetic risk scores.
Yeah,
and I'd love to hear more about that as well.
Comment. I'll get to genetic risk scores in just a second. I'll just make a brief comment. So people are probably familiar with GINA, right? So you cannot currently discriminate for at least health insurance on the basis of genetic information, and now we also have protection against pre-existing conditions more generally. But what Congress giveth can also take away, right? So. I think it's just, and that took enormous amounts of effort to get to this point, right? And it's still perfectly legal to discriminate for life insurance, right? So I think it is important to build these protections in over time and strengthen them. But I think it's also important to not make genetics, not sort of, not make it an exceptional kind of information. It is another kind of information in your healthcare record, just like everything else. There are some things that are special about it, but let's not sort of overly fetishize it, so to speak, right? As Siddhartha Mukherjee would say. So, okay, so now to polygenic risk score. So I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's a pretty recent thing, but this is an approach that has been extensively used in the cattle breeding field for many years, where basically you can breed cattle on the basis of your overall prediction for how much milk they'll make. Even though you don't understand any of the underlying biology at all, right? You're just kind of building models and using it to direct your breeding. And so recently, with studies like the UK Biobank, which genotyped 500,000 citizens of the UK in association with their medical records, scientists have been able to construct predictors for common disease, right? And in some cases, you can identify a small but substantial portion of the population that is at grossly elevated risk for certain diseases from day one, right? So it seems like a great opportunity both for early intervention, right, and treatment across a range of common diseases. This isn't going to be everyone who has diabetes, but it might be a substantial fraction. But it's also a great opportunity for discrimination if you're an insurance company, right? If you can identify that person on day one who is at high likelihood of having cancer. So I think it's going to be increasingly on radars, people's radars over the next year. And I think the key thing is this doesn't require genome sequencing. Right. If you have a 23andMe test or an Ancestry.com test, within a year or two, there will be websites where you can upload your data and it will spit back predictions, right? So, and they'll probably be more accurate than the predictions we have right now. But
on that note, I want to ask Elizabeth, what do we do with that information? So it's like a stocking stuffer now, right? I mean, how many people have done 23andMe or Ancestry? Oh, okay, not that. But how do we make sense of that information as a layman?
So I think as a layman, we have to be realistic and say it is impossible. Just like it is impossible for me to fully understand my lawyer or my mechanic. And that is okay. That's why we have genetic counselors. That's why we have geneticists. I recently went to a talk in Seattle given by a person who had a PhD after his name and was an optometrist, but styled himself as a physician. And he encouraged everybody to look at their 23andMe data for an MTHFR gene variant. And this variant is very common. About 35% of the population has at least one copy of it. So this gene variant happened to have been studied in over 100,000 people and actually does not substantively increase the risk of heart attack or stroke. However, he said that it does increase the risk of heart attack and stroke substantively, as well as autism, muscle weakness, and various other diseases, which have been debunked. So how are people to know that this person is actually peddling a supplement, folic acid, and not a legitimate physician? He sounded very scientific when he spoke, and only having gone through all these studies was I able to go to this lecture really for the purpose of debunking what he was going to do. And there are a number of websites now online which are actually fraudulent, where you can upload your 23andMe data and it will predict your risk of various diseases, and often they are selling supplements on the back end or other things. So I think having good scientific education from elementary school all the way through college is important. I think our media is important as a check and balance, but I also think it's important to see a trained geneticist or genetic counselor or physician.
Your presidential tweet?
Presidential
Oh
chat.
my gosh.
The emergency broadcast on your Wi-Fi system.
That's exactly what's happening, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Is it a tweet? Is it a tweet or is it a text? So just curious. Okay.
It's actually
Presidential
not from him.
text.
It's actually it's from an agency.
Sorry. I'm sorry that you were interrupted.
I think my point came across.
It's actually great timing. I have one last question, but I'm actually going to tell you what it is, and then I'm going to not have them answer it and answer yours. I'm an investor, and I'm going to corner them later and say, what's coming in 10 years? Where would you put your poker chips if you're an early stage investor now playing out 10 years? I think it would take long. We have a couple of minutes, and I know folks in the audience might have questions for these experts, so I'm actually going to open it up to a couple of questions if we don't get interrupted again. Is it a follow-up tweet? I'm just kidding. Any questions for the panel? If not, I'll ask him where we should invest. Okay.
I do have a question. You mentioned, and I thought it was pretty insightful and pretty interesting, about how innovation plays an important role and how we have to keep innovating so we don't rob humanity of the cure of cancer. But also, as you mentioned that, I'm following that train of thought. what do you feel like is your responsibility of how to share that technology and that findings with the rest of the world? Like, for example, in Mexico, it's pretty common when you're treating with oncology to fly to Houston. Or if you want to get pregnant and you're having trouble with fertility, you also have to fly down to Houston. So how would you share that information, and how technology is actually going to play a role to not only be focused like in the U.S. but worldwide?
Yeah.
Because it's a problem. Healthcare
So-
is a problem worldwide.
So, and if everyone didn't hear, it's really this idea of sharing the innovations we have here globally and ensuring that collaboration is happening.
I think Fred Hutch feels that responsibility very strongly. We have a campus in Uganda. Almost all the hospital systems where I've worked have had hematologists come from North Africa to train and are working to build that sort of infrastructure. But this problem is real. We sometimes have inquiries from people who live elsewhere in the world who want, for example, a transplant. And while we can perform that transplant, when they return to their local environment, they might not have access to physicians who are capable of managing the long-term immunosuppression that these patients are likely to be on. They might not have access to appropriate disease monitoring for relapse. And so that transplant is likely to fail them because of lack of access to the technology that you need to be sustained in order to sustain a good outcome of even the best transplants. There's a wonderful book. The author is I. Glenn Cohen, called Patients with Passports. And I highly encourage people to read that book. It goes into a lot of what you said and proposes some interesting regulatory solutions.
Thanks. Another question? The back, over here.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys can hear me, but I'm curious if, so I'm interested in applying deep learning to health data. I'm curious how much of compliance and regulations, which is very important, how much of that sort of gets in the way of making forward progress on gathering the data that's relevant for the research to move the ball forward?
Well, one of the first things we do when we see a patient is we ask them for permission to continuously obtain their medical records. And Fred Hutch, at least on the transplant side, I can speak to that, we have a wonderful long-term follow-up program where patients who have signed on to this program, and most of them do choose to participate, we receive records from their local physicians, whether in their Hawaii, Alaska, if they're on the other side of the world, roughly every 3 to 6 months, and those records are scanned into our system.
Let me make sure that,
Is that what you were asking?
or are you asking
about
an even deeper question on the security?
There is a deeper element in terms of medical record. So I fundamentally believe patients ought to own their data, right? Just like we own our money, we should own the data.
Sure.
So the question really is, how does the shareability of it work in the context of governance, data governance, compliance, and regulation? It's sort of it's about.
That's a big one.
There is quite a extensive amount of regulation, but it's applied differently from institution to institution, and I would say even maybe beyond that sometimes within that. And it is, I can speak to, it's actually one of the complications with ordering cell therapy right now, actually, on a commercial level, is that you have to go through quite a few number of hoops in order to actually get the right data into the right hands to then be able to order the product and then actually get reimbursed. And so we shouldn't have complete open access to electronic health records, but at the same time, there needs to be a certain amount of access, and some of it is done through waivers, but a lot of it still is kind of kept rather locked down. And so that's for good purpose, but on the other side, to your point, the usability of that data to actually do something for the patient itself is difficult unless you're within the four walls of that particular institution. So it is a challenge, and I think it's one we're starting to work with. As I said, innovation needs to come along on the security side to ensure that where that data goes is the right place to go and that it has been authorized by the patient for those purposes. And those sort of, I would say, coordination and coalition of that data that says it's okay isn't necessarily even close right now.
I'll take one more question, but the multidisciplinary, the example with Microsoft and Adaptive, that's exactly what you need. You absolutely have to have multidisciplinary teams that are solving these problems. It can't just be tech or science, I would argue.
Earlier you commented on issues associated with data privacy and where data is stored and genetic screening tests and that sort of thing. A lot
It's a great question, and the question really is as you think about this globally and say your data ends up in another country, how are you assured that it's being held at the same standards, say in the United States or elsewhere? And is there some collaboration globally to make some standards? I believe that I can say honestly is that there is no clear answer globally, but there is some effort to do so. Because, and I'll go back to the statement I made earlier, you have GDPR that came into Europe. Nobody even knows how to apply GDPR. I can tell you we actually went through an audit and we're certifiable, I guess, but nobody knows who issues a certificate for it. So even within Europe, I would say, where you have a group of countries that work together on a lot of different things, they can't really come to a complete understanding of that. So I do think that as we become more and more of a global, well, that's kind of a strange thing to say, but we're crossing borders, and it's not just people crossing borders, it's data, it's products crossing borders. It is something that I think individual regions have worked on, and you have a decent, I would say for most countries, there's some decent standards, but they aren't the same standards. And there isn't really a collaboration to have that be a global standard. The question then, of course, comes who oversees that, who collects all that, who does. So there's some practical issues, but there is still, I would say, the strategic need for it. And we're definitely a long ways away from that, I can tell you.
Yeah, more to come. And I know there's probably more questions. Maybe you can grab folks in the hallways or over lunch, but I know we need to wrap up. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.